Hi, everybody. I would like to introduce something new I'm going to be doing on Mondays, and that's giving you a bit of an introduction to this week's Social Studies Weekly issue. This is both for students who are learning the content, of course, but also for parents if you want to get your brain wrapped around some of the big ideas that we're going to be covering in this issue. That way you can help support your student. So for this week, let's check out Google Classroom here. For this week, I'm going to go ahead and drop this video in its own assignment here for Monday, May 4th, tomorrow. That way it stands out a little bit. Going forward, I will include it in the initial weekly assignment here on Google Classroom, where I will attach the video and, of course, have the login to whatever articles I would like you to read that day. And the Think and Review assignment will just continue to be its own assignment here. All right, well, let's get into it. So first off, I want to talk about just some of the big, broad ideas that are covered in these articles. So one of the big things that really drove the beginning of the American Revolution was the idea that people should have power in government, not a king or queen. That was the source of a lot of the arguments and disagreements with the colonists and with the king. Everything from the Quartering Act to the Royal Proclamation to the Stamp Act to the unfair taxes, all that kind of stuff. Another big thing that you are going to read about is the idea that each state or each colony wrote its own constitution before the United States Constitution. Oh, and by the way, let me back up just a little bit. We're kind of in this transitional phase that is following the end of the American Revolution, and it's a time when this new nation is deciding how it should govern itself. And so one of the first things that needed to happen were those initial 13 colonies would become states, and they would write their own constitutions, their own set of laws. And a lot of these would end up being a big influence in the writing of the United States Constitution, even though a lot of those state constitutions were fairly different. They were often based on very similar ideals, but the way that those citizens of those colonies and states wanted to govern themselves might have been a little bit different. So you'll read about some different state constitutions. Another big idea that did not exist prior to the American Revolution was the idea that basic human rights should be protected by being written into law. So this would eventually become the Bill of Rights as part of the United States Constitution. You're going to read about the idea of separation of powers. We've talked about that a little bit in class, the idea that there are three different branches of government and each of them has its own specific powers. Another big idea was just the idea that equality under the law should be written into the Constitution, or it was supposedly, but it really is not always practiced that way, even though it is really a founding principle of our country. So these are the articles that you're going to read this week. I will go ahead and go into a little bit more detail on each of them. So first article on the front page, Power to the People. This is, again, we are at the end of the American Revolution, and the patriots are trying to figure out, how are we going to create a government? What should we do? How should we govern ourselves? So the idea of writing a United States Constitution, and also, again, writing constitutions for each state. And the founding fathers of our country and even of the states, they wanted to be really different from the British. Again, that's part of why that drive for independence happened in the first place. They wanted laws to be difficult to change. They didn't want a king to just be able to say, oh, that law is no good anymore. How about a new law? They wanted no taxation with representation. That was a big rallying cry of the revolution, of course. And again, they wanted people to have the power, not a king or queen. There were a lot of challenges that were facing them at this time. They needed to decide on who their leaders were going to be, what those leaders' roles would be. And like I said earlier, each state had different ideas about how to make these choices, how to make these decisions. And as I said, these state constitution would eventually be looked on when the writers of the Constitution were working on it. And they would take a lot of those ideas from the state constitutions and put into the United States Constitution. Next article, power through rights. Hopefully you're seeing a theme already here. So the writers of the state constitutions had a lot of ideas. They had a lot of resources to draw upon. The first big idea was just, again, the basic human rights of citizens and how they needed to be protected by the government. One of the resources they had available to them was a document called the Magna Carta. This is a very old document written back in the year 1215, signed by the King of England at the time. And it changed some ways that kings and queens dealt with their people. And you'll read more about that in the article. Another big idea here, that all men are, quote unquote, created equal, and they should be free and independent. But again, this did not always happen in practice. Back then and even today, of course. So, women did not have power. Slaves, of course, did not have power. Another big idea about the separation of powers, again, those three branches of government, meaning that none of those branches would have any more power than another. And again, a lot of these ideas would be borrowed when the U.S. Constitution was written. Speaking of separation of powers, again, the idea that the government should not be ruled by a king or queen, but by its citizens. They would develop three different branches of governments, and each of these branches would have different responsibilities. The idea of checks and balances came out of this structure, which is that each branch would have an equal amount of power, and each could check or limit the power of the others. That way, no branch had more power than another. So there is the legislative branch. This is the branch that writes the laws. There's the executive branch. And I know you're starting to hear that song in your head, executive branch, executive branch. Or if you didn't, now you do. This is the branch that enforces the laws. And then finally, the judicial branch. This is the branch of government that interprets the laws and says whether they believe they are constitutional or not. And you'll learn a little bit more about John Marshall, who's one of the first Supreme Court justices, and his influence on the future of the Supreme Court. The article, all men are created equal, with a question mark. Obviously, that's there to, to question that idea that all men really were created equal. But these were the words that were put into the Declaration of Independence. But in fact, many people were not treated equally. A lot of states, actually most states, allowed only white men who owned property to vote. Obviously, that's pretty limiting. And a lot of groups it would be a long time before other groups would be recognized into law. But not always in practice. Still to this day, there are plenty of groups of people who are fighting for their rights, for their basic human rights. But some of the groups that have been written into law, President Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation for slaves. That didn't happen until 90 years later. And, they didn't get the vote for many years after that. We've talked about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. A lot of those rights didn't come until much later. And as I said, there's a lot of groups that are still fighting for these rights today, even though supposedly it's written into our laws. Women were not given the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. That was in 1920. So that was just 100 years ago. And all citizens were given the right to vote at age 18 in 1971. That was only about 40 years ago. And for our last article here, you're just going to read about a few different state governments, how they were similar, how they were different. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. I'll let you read the slide and also read the articles. So just to wrap it up here, a few reminders. Make sure you're reading those assigned articles each day, and make sure you're answering those questions. After each article, there's a few questions to answer. You can earn some coins to play the games and do the different activities. Make sure that week 26 Think and Review is completed by Friday. Hopefully you're doing a little bit of that each day. Don't wait until Thursday or Friday to start that assignment. Just do a little bit each day after you read an article. Take a look and see what questions you can answer. And then finally, take that test by the end of the week as well. So that should be done by Friday. One other idea just to kind of throw out here, and a few people have actually requested this from me. Let's say you take that test and you realize oh man, I thought I would do better than that. I only got a 3 or a 5 or something like that. And if you want to take it retake it, just shoot me an email. Say, hey, I didn't do as well on this test, Mr. G, as I would like to, so I would like to please retake it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there and enjoy.